Hello again. We're in Nelson Barbour, Charles Taze Russell, Three Worlds, The Plan of Redemption, page 100. Barbour and Russell have been discussing the significance of the date 1875 and the Jubilee shadows of this, and they're absolutely sure that the Great Jubilee starts in 1875. He goes on with this same subject, which seems to obsess him here, and I can understand why, as you realize how he got the idea. That is Nelson Barbour. He tells you a little bit about that, not just from Scripture. Watch what he says here. Our next argument, or as we will call it, the other half of this, is drawn from prophecy. For the law and the prophets are one and inseparable in spirit. Hence truth in all these glorious subjects is double, or like a two-edged sword. When the above argument, as drawn from the Jubilee cycles, was first seen by the writer in the spring of 1874, it was not the result of a long course of investigation, like most of these arguments, but of a sudden happy thought, or, had it been on some more common theme, I should have said inspiration. But at the same moment that the idea occurred that from their last typical Jubilee to the antitype should be a cycle of a multiple of their largest and last Sabbath, the idea also occurred that as the 70 years, commonly called the captivity, were designed of God for the purpose of permitting the land to enjoy its Sabbaths, and that their captivity was only a secondary matter, not even measured by the 70 years, since Daniel and the greater part of the nation were carried away 18 years before that 70 began. The idea occurred, I say, that as this 70 years was that the land might enjoy her Sabbaths, it ought to be the key to the whole Sabbatic system. I knew God had said the land did not enjoy her Sabbaths while they were dwelling upon it, and that it had not enjoyed its Sabbaths since it had been trodden down of the Gentiles. And yet God claimed that it had enjoyed them, that he had made it desolate till it had enjoyed them, and that he had made it desolate 70 years for that very purpose. And then he references the text the Watchtower uses to this day as basic on this argument for the 70-year desolation, 2 Chronicles 36, verse 21. Hence, the very natural suggestion that 70 should in some way be a measure to the system of Sabbaths to the land, and the question immediately presented itself, will not the time from entering the land of promise, where this system of Sabbaths began, to AD 1875, prove to be just 70 of these cycles? I was in the street, some distance from my office, when these two lines of argument, both new, presented themselves. It was in the evening, and as I could not see to add up the figures until reaching the office, I immediately turned my face homeward. I walked fast, but walking was too slow. I ran through the streets of the city, eager to get to paper and pencil. And oh, the thrill of joy when I found the result. That is, that from their last Jubilee, a Jubilee of Jubilees, or on the other hand 70 cycles, measuring from where the system began, would in either case terminate on the 6th of April, 1875, then some 6 months in the future. Don't forget he said these events took place in 1874. The great flood of light that is now shining on the end of the world was obscure at that time, and from the force of old traditions, I naturally expected more in the spring of 1875 than these arguments warranted. Indeed, I then supposed the great changes at hand would in some way be carried out on the plane of the flesh. Now this is a very important point. And that all the world might see and know what was going on, forgetting that, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man, and that they were to go on planting, building, and marrying, and know not. So he admits that after this happy inspiration, which he seems to have got in the street, both to the significance of the 70, it was the desolation of the city and the land, not the exile, and to the Jubilee system that is based on types and parallels, as we saw in the previous 2 segments. This came to him in the street. Did he check this sudden inspiration, this happy thought, against the commentaries on the books of Chronicles, or the exile, or the book of Daniel, or Jeremiah? There's lots of commentaries dealing with this very period, and none of them make the same, none of them get this happy thought that somehow the 70 years is the equivalent of the desolation of the land. The 70 years is usually linked to the dynasty of Nebuchadnezzar, 70 years long, Jeremiah 25, or to the 70 years of the exile. And the exile began with the first exile, the Daniel exile. The second exile was Ezekiel, and the third was the destruction of the city. None of these conclusions were checked against the commentaries. And so you see that the source of the mistake about the 70 years and the source of the confusion about the date 606, 607, well, it's 606 back then, and it was kept that way in the Watchtower for a long time till they realized there's no 0 year. We took that up in the last segment. So the confusion wasn't necessary, and it goes back to a happy inspiration that Nelson Barbour admits he had one day. And I think that the fact that that's the foundational mistake of the Watchtower is so tragic that it really goes back to a confirmation, as it were, that Nelson Barbour got one day for what he'd already calculated from other means in the Old Testament had to do with the beginning of the Jubilee system and the end of it, and the end of it being related to the date 1875. They've scrapped that date, but all the other conclusions that were connected to it or derived from it, they have kept. At least they've kept the one that counts the most. That is the idea that the last generation before Armageddon would begin in 1914. So I've put a link into one more thought. Let me reread that sentence at the end. I then suppose the great changes at hand would in some way be carried out on the plane of the flesh. So Barbour is in effect admitting that the expectations they had around 1875 didn't actually take place. In whatever did take place took place invisibly, just like the parousia, which they had already assumed would begin in 1874. Also unnecessary. I put a link into 607 witnesses against the Watchtower, where I bring forward the evidence I had to collect over a 6 or 7 year period when I went to the libraries to find if there's any support at all for the date 607. And to my great disappointment found out there was absolutely no leg to stand on, just as Ray Franz had found out. So I'll put the link to Ray Franz's discoveries in the libraries of New York about this very same thing, the great mistake of this false foundation, the date 607.